The small transport ship touched down with a heavy thud, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled in the baking heat of the desert planet. The team of young humans stepped out, squinting as the twin suns bore down on them. The planet, designated Zeta-12, had earned its reputation across the galaxy as a death trap. It was barren. No forests, no rivers, not even any sign of wildlife. Just miles upon miles of shifting sand and jagged rocks, and a temperature so high that most species couldn't breathe without specialized equipment. The humans, however, were undeterred. They were used to difficult conditions. They had trained for this moment, though even they weren't sure if they could truly survive here. Emily adjusted the straps on her backpack, glancing around. The planet's sky was an intense orange hue, its air thick and suffocating. She could already feel the sweat pooling at the base of her neck, but she was determined. She had to show everyone that humanity could handle what no other species could. "All right, team," she said, her voice firm and steady. "Let's get our bearings and set up camp. We have to work quickly, or the heat will break us before the first nightfall." The others nodded, following her lead. There was Marcus, the former soldier, grizzled, skeptical, and the type of person who preferred the straight path, no matter how tough it was. Then there was Priya, a biologist with a deep knowledge of ecosystems, and Jonah, the youngest member of the group, barely 18, but quick with a solution when the team ran into trouble. Together, they represented humanity's best: adaptable, resourceful, and always ready to innovate. But their teacher, Captain Zilkar, wasn't impressed. The Varkan instructor stood by the landing platform, his six-jointed legs folding beneath him in a posture of quiet superiority. His silver skin shimmered under the harsh light, his dark eyes scanning the group with a look that could only be described as pity. He had seen many species try and fail on this planet. He had little faith that these humans would be any different. "You think you can survive here?" Zilkar's voice was a low, gravelly growl. "I have taught the strongest species in the galaxy. None of them made it, and you're only human." Emily met his gaze, unflinching. "Maybe we're different. We've survived the impossible before." Zilkar chuckled darkly, his multifaceted eyes narrowing. "We shall see. But you will fail, just like the rest." With that, the Varkan turned and walked off, leaving the humans to figure out how they would survive in the desert's oppressive heat. The first few hours were spent setting up their base. There wasn't much they could do beyond establishing a simple shelter with the emergency gear provided. Zilkar had warned them that nothing they could carry would protect them from the intense heat. By midday, the temperature had soared to unbearable levels. The air shimmered above the sand, distorting everything in its wake. Emily wiped the sweat from her brow, trying not to let her concern show. If they didn't figure out how to manage water soon, they wouldn't last the day. "I can't believe this place," Priya muttered, her face flushed with heat. "There's nothing here, nothing alive." Jonah shook his head, visibly uncomfortable. "We can't even get any shade. And the ground's too hot to sit on. What's our next move, Emily?" Emily took a deep breath and turned to the others. "We need to build something to catch water. Anything that can help us survive. I know it's going to be rough, but we got to think outside the box." Zilkar's voice echoed from across the compound, his tone thick with scorn. "You're wasting your time. You should be preparing for death, not pretending you can change the laws of nature." But Emily ignored him. She grabbed a small piece of reflective material from their survival kit. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She began to outline a plan, using what little they had to build a rudimentary water condenser. The others looked at her, unsure but willing to follow her lead. They worked quickly, as Zilkar watched from a distance, arms crossed and shaking his head. "You will regret this," he muttered, knowing full well that he was giving them an impossible task. The day was slipping away, the heat relentless. Yet, even under the Varkan's heady gaze, Emily pushed forward. She wouldn't let the team fail. She couldn't, not after all they had been through to get here, And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, Emily held her breath. She activated the device they'd cobbled together. It sputtered, then hummed to life. A trickle of water. Just a small amount, but enough to give them hope. Zilkar, watching from a distance, felt the first flicker of doubt. He couldn't understand how they were doing it. He had to admit, the humans were doing the impossible. The first night on Zeta 12 was a grueling test of endurance. The temperature dropped sharply after sunset, but the ground remained an unforgiving furnace. The makeshift shelter, crafted from their emergency supplies, offered little relief from the biting cold that gnawed at their bones. Emily huddled in a corner, trying to keep the team as warm as possible while keeping the makeshift water condenser working. The faint trickle of water they'd managed to gather was a lifeline, but it wasn't enough. They needed more. "Tomorrow, we'll need to go deeper into the desert," Emily said, breaking the silence as she looked out at the endless horizon. "We need to find more resources. We can't rely on this shelter and what we've gathered for much longer." Marcus, who had been quiet since their arrival, grunted in acknowledgement, but didn't look convinced. "This is pointless," he muttered, his voice a harsh rasp from the dust and heat. "You're all talking about surviving, but none of us are equipped for this. The best we can hope for is a quick death." His words hung heavily in the air, but Emily refused to let them defeat her. "We'll make it. If we stick together and keep thinking, we'll find a way." Priya, who had been inspecting their water supply, nodded. "We've already made it this far. And we've got something the others didn't, each other." Jonah looked up from his map of the desert. "We're not even halfway through the day, and it's already impossible to breathe out there. The heat will kill us long before we find anything else. What's our plan, Emily?" She stared at the map, scanning the rough terrain, her mind running through every survival strategy she ever studied. "We need to move quickly, but carefully. The goal is to find a place that offers some protection from the sun, and maybe a few resources. If we can't find anything by midday, we'll head back to camp and rethink." The team nodded in agreement, though it was clear they were struggling to keep up their optimism. The odds were overwhelmingly against them. As the first rays of the twin suns crested the horizon, they packed up their shelter and set off. Emily led the way, keeping her pace steady and calculated, conserving their strength as much as possible. Every step they took was a struggle against the heat, the dust, and the suffocating air. But they kept moving. Meanwhile, Zilkar observed them from a distance, perched on a rock with his arms crossed. The Varkan captain was still skeptical. He hadn't expected them to last even the first day, let alone make it through the night. But here they were, walking into the desert as if they had a chance. "I'll give them one thing," he muttered to himself. "They're persistent, but persistence will only take them so far." The day wore on, and as the sun climbed higher in the sky, the heat became unbearable. The sand, now a blinding white, shimmered like molten lava. The temperature soared past dangerous levels, but the humans kept pushing forward, refusing to stop. They had no choice. Emily wasn't about to let them fail. By midday, exhaustion began to creep into the group. Marcus had started to slow, his face drenched in sweat, his breathing labored. Priya's movements were sluggish, and Jonah was visibly struggling to keep up. Yet, Emily's determination never wavered. She urged them onward, taking short breaks when necessary, but never allowing them to lose focus. "We're close," she insisted, though the horizon still appeared endless. "We can make it." Just as it seemed like they might collapse from the relentless heat, Emily spotted something in the distance, an outcropping of rocks, providing the first real shelter they'd seen since landing. She quickened her pace, urging the others to follow her. When they reached the rocks, they collapsed under the shade, grateful for the brief respite. Emily allowed herself a moment of relief before getting back to work. "We'll rest here for a few hours and wait for the sun to pass its zenith. After that, we'll head back to camp with whatever we can carry." The team agreed, and they set to work building a small windbreak from the nearby rocks and anything they could salvage. The next few hours felt like an eternity, but they kept their spirits high. Zilkar watched from afar, still unconvinced. His words echoed in his mind. No species has survived this place, not even the toughest. But as he watched Emily coordinate the group, he couldn't help but feel a spark of curiosity. Maybe there was more to these humans than he had assumed. Still, he wasn't ready to admit defeat. As the sun finally began to dip lower, the temperature began to ease. They packed up their meager supplies and prepared to return to the camp, with Emily's leadership keeping them focused. Despite the hardships, despite the doubts, humanity had taken another step toward survival. Zilkar couldn't deny it any longer. The humans had proven something he hadn't expected. They were still here, and they weren't giving up. But could they last? That was a question he couldn't answer yet, and deep down, he wasn't sure he wanted to. The desert, despite its seeming desolation, was alive with challenges, and as the days passed, the toll of survival began to crack at the seams of the human team. The initial excitement and optimism had started to fade, replaced by exhaustion, frustration, and doubts that had begun to creep into their minds. The sun never relented, and every step felt heavier than the last. They had managed to find a small supply of resources, rocks that provided shade, scraps of metal that could be repurposed. But there was only so much they could do with the limited gear they had. And the longer they stayed out in the desert, the more their morale eroded. Marcus, once the strongest member of the team, now seemed to be slowing down. The soldier who had fought in numerous battles, who had seen the worst that humanity could endure, was now struggling to carry his weight in this alien landscape. His face was sunburned, his lips cracked, and his usual hard-edged resolve was slipping. "I'm telling you, this is pointless," Marcus muttered during one of their brief rest periods. "We're going to die out here. There's no point in pretending like we have a chance. I'm done." Emily, who had spent the last few days pushing the team forward, stopped in her tracks. Her face was haggard from the constant exposure to the heat, but her eyes were steely. "We don't get to give up. Not now. Not ever. We're in this together, and we'll make it through." "You're stronger than this, Marcus." He shook his head, frustration bubbling over. "You don't get it. I've seen what happens when people push too far. They break. We'll break, Emily. All of us. And when we do, it'll be too late." The other team members, Priya and Jonah, stood silently by, watching the exchange. Emily felt the weight of Marcus's words hit her, but she wasn't about to back down. "That's exactly why we can't stop. If we let ourselves think we can't make it, then we already have. Think of everything we've already survived. We've made it through the heat, the storms, the lack of water. Every time the odds were against us, we found a way. And we'll do it again." Marcus glared at her, his jaw clenched. But as his gaze met hers, something softened in his eyes. "I don't know how much more I can take," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "You don't have to do it alone," Emily said quietly. "We're all in this, and we're not quitting. Not now, not ever." For a moment, Marcus just stood there, torn between his doubts and the undeniable truth of Emily's words. Finally, he exhaled sharply, his posture slumping. "Fine, but don't expect me to be happy about it." Emily allowed herself a small smile, but it was fleeting. She knew this wouldn't be easy, not physically, not mentally. They were running low on supplies, and the harsh desert didn't care about their feelings. Still, she couldn't let the team fracture now. Not when they were so close. The tension didn't end with Marcus, though. Priya, the biologist, had been quieter than usual. Her knowledge of the desert's ecosystem was invaluable, but even she couldn't help them avoid the inevitable. The constant strain of surviving on this hostile planet. "We're running out of time," Priya said, breaking the silence later that day as they trudged back to their shelter. "We need to find more resources, real shelter, food, something. This place is draining us, one day at a time." Emily nodded, her mind already racing. Tomorrow, we go farther. We have no choice. If we're going to make it, we need more. Jonah, the youngest, had been unusually quiet the last few hours. His usually optimistic demeanor was replaced by a sense of quiet despair. I don't know how much more I can keep pushing, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. It feels like we're walking in circles. We don't even know if we're getting anywhere. Emily's heart sank as she saw the fatigue on his face. Jonah had been the one to crack jokes, the one who kept the mood light, but now even he was beginning to feel the weight of their situation. This wasn't just about surviving the desert anymore. It was about surviving each other's doubts, fears, and exhaustion. But Emily wouldn't give in. Not now. Listen, she said, gathering the group around as the shadows of the night crept in. We've come too far to turn back. We're going to find a way to make this work. Together. I know it's hard, but we've faced worse before, and we're still here. All of us. They looked at her, tired but resolute. Slowly, one by one, they nodded, as if the strength of her words gave them just a little more energy to keep going. As night fell and the stars twinkled far above, Emily knew the fight for survival wasn't just against the desert. It was against their own doubts. The hardest challenge was learning to trust each other when the world felt like it was crumbling. But if they could hold on to that, they just might have a chance. The desert planet had a way of throwing everything at you when you least expected it. After several days of grueling survival, the team had finally begun to feel the weight of exhaustion and despair lifting. They had managed to collect more resources, repair their shelter, and even had a few small moments of reprieve. Their small water condenser was still working, providing them with just enough hydration to keep going, and they had found a rare patch of the desert where the heat wasn't as oppressive. But as the sun dipped low in the sky, the winds began to shift. And this time, they weren't just facing the sun's relentless rays. Emily squinted against the sudden gust of wind. A shift in the air was almost imperceptible at first, but she could feel it. There was something coming, something dangerous. We need to get inside now, she shouted over the rising wind. The others barely had time to react. The sand, which had been a steady feature of the landscape, suddenly began to whip around them with terrifying force. What had seemed like a mild breeze in the distance had now grown into something much more violent. The ground trembled, and the sky darkened as a massive sandstorm began to build on the horizon, its ferocity growing by the second. Zilkar's warning echoed in Emily's mind. No species has ever survived this planet. Not even the toughest. It seemed as though the desert was proving his point. The storm was closing in fast, and there was nowhere to hide. We need to get to shelter, Marcus shouted, his voice almost lost in the roar of the wind. We can't fight this. We'll be buried alive. Emily's heart raced. The shelter they had worked so hard to build wasn't going to survive the force of this storm. She glanced around, searching for some kind of refuge. But the desert was relentless. The only thing visible was the vast, barren wasteland stretching out before them. And the storm, its intensity now almost blinding, was rapidly engulfing everything in its path. Move. We need to get out of the open, Emily barked. She grabbed Marcus's arm, urging him to follow her toward the rocks they had used for shelter earlier, the ones that had offered them some protection from the sun. The others scrambled to follow, their legs heavy with fatigue but driven by a shared instinct for survival. The wind picked up, slashing across their skin like sandpaper. The sky had turned a sickly orange, and the swirling dust made it impossible to see anything more than a few feet ahead. Emily could barely hear anything except the deafening roar of the storm, but she kept her focus on the rocks. It was their best hope for shelter. They made it just in time. As they huddled together beneath the rock outcrop, the storm hit with full force. The wind howled like a living creature, tearing at their clothing and forcing them to shield their eyes. The sand pummeled them relentlessly, stinging their exposed skin and leaving a fine layer of grit over every inch of their bodies. For hours, they huddled in the rocky shelter, the storm raging outside. The noise was deafening, and the earth trembled beneath the onslaught. It felt as though the planet itself was trying to swallow them whole. Every time the storm grew quieter, the tension in the air increased, as if they were waiting for the next wave of destruction to hit. Inside the rocky refuge, the group was silent, each of them trying to conserve their energy and their resolve. Emily kept glancing out toward the storm, trying to gauge when it might let up. But the sandstorm showed no signs of easing. Marcus, who had been quiet during the storm, now spoke up. "This is it, isn't it? This planet is going to kill us. We can't keep fighting this." Emily turned to him, her face grim but determined. "No, this storm isn't the end. We'll survive it, just like we survived everything else." Her words were met with skeptical stares, but she refused to back down. "We've made it this far, haven't we? That means we can make it through this too." The hours dragged on as they waited, listening to the relentless howl of the wind and the shifting of the sand. Each member of the group, exhausted and worn down by the heat, the fear, and the storm, fought their own internal battles. Would they really survive this? Or was Emily's determination the only thing keeping them going? As the storm began to subside, Emily's mind raced. There was still hope. There had to be. But now, they faced a new reality. The desert had shown them its power, and they would have to be smarter, faster, and more resourceful than ever if they were going to make it to the end of this challenge. As the winds finally began to die down, Emily stood, peering out from behind the rocky shelter. The storm had passed, but its aftermath was a stark reminder of the planet's merciless nature. "We've made it through," Emily whispered to herself, though she knew it was far from over. Marcus, though still weary, finally spoke with a newfound respect in his voice. "I don't know how you do it, but you keep us going." Emily looked at her team, a quiet smile creeping onto her face. "We don't give up. Not now. Not ever." And with that, they gathered their things and prepared to face whatever came next, knowing that the worst had yet to be over, but also knowing that they had survived the first true test of the desert's fury. The storm had passed, but the desert showed no mercy. The ground, now scarred with the marks of the sandstorm, felt even more inhospitable than before. The sun had risen once again, beating down with unforgiving intensity. The team had managed to salvage what they could from the wreckage of their temporary shelter, but much of their gear had been destroyed. Their water reserves were lower than they would have liked, and the morale of the group, already fragile, had been shaken. Emily gathered the group in the only bit of shade they could find, a narrow crevice between two boulders. Their faces were grim, their bodies tired, but Emily's eyes still burned with determination. She couldn't afford to let them falter now, not after everything they had been through. "We need to keep moving," Emily said, her voice steady but strained. "We can't stay here. We have to find more resources, more water, or we'll die out here. But we'll do it together." Marcus, ever the skeptic, was the first to speak. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his face drawn and weary. "Together. That's been the plan from the start, hasn't it? But it's not enough anymore. We're too close to the edge, Emily. This planet doesn't want us here. You've seen what it does. We've seen what it does. I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending like we're going to pull through." Emily clenched her fists, trying to hold back her frustration. "You think I don't know how hard it is, but I can't let us give up. Not now. Not when we've come so far." Priya, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up. "Emily's right. We don't have much choice. If we don't move forward, we won't make it. But we have to work smarter. The desert isn't just about brute force. It's about finding the right patterns, reading the signs. There's a way out of this." Jonah, sitting with his head buried in his hands, finally looked up. His face was gaunt, his eyes tired, but the spark of hope that had fueled him earlier was still there, flickering. "We've survived so far because we've been resourceful. We have to keep being resourceful." Emily nodded, her gaze shifting between the team members. She saw the doubt in their eyes, the exhaustion that hung over them like a cloud. They were all struggling, but she couldn't show weakness. Not yet. Not when there was still hope. "We need to head toward that mountain range in the distance," Emily said, pointing toward the far-off peaks, barely visible against the desert's vastness. "It's the only landmark we've seen for days. There might be caves or some sort of shelter there. And it's our best bet for finding water." Marcus shook his head, his expression a mixture of skepticism and fatigue. "That's a long way to go. We're already running on fumes, Emily. We'll be too weak by the time we get there." "We don't have a choice," Emily replied, her voice firm. "We can't stay here, and we don't have enough water to make it back to the camp. The mountain range is our only shot." The team fell silent, their faces etched with doubt. It was clear they didn't want to push forward, but Emily was resolute. They had to keep moving, or they would risk succumbing to the desert's wrath. With a collective, resigned sigh, they gathered their meager belongings and began their trek toward the mountains. The heat was relentless, and their steps were heavy. Every movement felt like an effort, as if the desert itself was trying to weigh them down and crush their resolve. But through sheer willpower, they pressed on. Emily kept her eyes fixed on the distant peaks, telling herself that they could make it, that they would find what they needed before it was too late. As the hours passed, the desert seemed to stretch on endlessly, the horizon a blur of shimmering sand. Their water supply had dwindled to almost nothing, and the harsh winds that had torn through them during the storm had left them with cuts and bruises. But despite the growing exhaustion, Emily kept pushing them forward. Around midday, the landscape began to change. The sand gave way to rocky terrain, and the air felt marginally cooler. It wasn't much, but it was a sign that they were nearing something. Hope flickered in their chests like a tiny flame. "We're close," Emily said, her voice filled with a quiet sense of triumph. "We can make it." But as they continued their climb up the rocky incline, the strain began to show. Marcus stumbled, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Priya was visibly struggling, her shoulders slumped in exhaustion. Jonah, despite his usual enthusiasm, seemed to be on the verge of collapsing. "We can't stop," Emily urged, her eyes locked on the distant peaks. "Not yet. We're almost there." But as she said those words, a thought crossed her mind. What if they didn't make it? What if the desert's cruel grasp had already claimed them, and they just didn't know it yet? The question lingered in her mind, but she pushed it aside. They couldn't afford to give in to fear, not when they were so close. And with that, they pressed on, toward the mountains, toward their last hope for survival. The climb toward the mountains was grueling. The rocky terrain offered little respite from the harshness of the desert. The sun, relentless and unyielding, beat down on them without mercy, and their bodies were screaming for rest. But the team pressed on, driven by the faint hope that somewhere ahead, shelter, water, and safety awaited them. Marcus was the first to fall behind. His steps had grown slower, his breathing heavier. His skin, once bronzed from days under the sun, was now pale and coated with a fine layer of sweat and dust. He had been pushing himself too hard, too long, and it was beginning to take its toll. Emily caught sight of him lagging and slowed her pace to match his. "Marcus, you need to keep up," Emily said, her voice low but firm. "We're almost there." "I can't," he gasped, collapsing onto a nearby rock. "I'm done. I'm not going any further." Emily felt her heart sink. She had always known there would come a point when the group might falter, but seeing it in front of her, the visible toll on someone who had once been so strong, hit harder than she had anticipated. "We can't stop here," she said, kneeling beside him. "You know that. We have to get to the mountains. We'll rest when we're there." Marcus shook his head, his face drawn with exhaustion. "I don't think I can make it that far. The sand, the heat, it's too much. Maybe it's better if we don't make it at all. We fought long enough." His words were like a weight pressing down on her chest. Emily had always been the optimist, the one who kept pushing, but even she had her limits. She felt the weight of the desert's crushing pressure on her spirit, threatening to swallow everything they had worked for. "No," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We keep going. We're not giving up. You're not giving up." There was a long pause before Marcus slowly stood, wiping the sweat from his brow. "I'm not giving up," he muttered, his voice weak but determined. "But don't ask me to pretend this is easy." Emily helped him to his feet, knowing that any sign of weakness from her might cause the others to break as well. The team had already started gathering around them, looking just as exhausted, just as beaten down by the desert's cruel demands. Jonah, despite his earlier doubts, was the next to speak up. "We can't stop," he said, his voice surprisingly strong. "We can't let everything we've been through go to waste. We've been fighting for this long, right?" Priya, her face etched with fatigue, nodded. "Jonah's right. We don't have the luxury of giving up." Emily felt a spark of hope as she looked at the faces of her team. They were all struggling, but they weren't backing down. Not yet. Not when they were so close. The mountain range was now within sight, and though it still felt like an insurmountable distance, it was their only chance. "All right," Emily said, her voice steady again. "We keep going. We take one step at a time, and when we get there, we rest. We make it to that mountain, and we're not turning back." The team nodded, even though they knew it was easier said than done. They had been walking through the desert for what felt like an eternity, and the weight of their exhaustion was visible in each one of them. But Emily's words, simple as they were, reminded them that they weren't alone in this. They pressed on, slowly but steadily, as the mountains grew closer, looming like silent sentinels in the distance. But with each step, the desert felt even more oppressive. The air grew thicker, the heat more suffocating. The terrain became rockier, the incline steeper. With every step forward, the weight of doubt began to settle in again. Had they made a mistake? Were they walking toward salvation or doom? "Are we really going to make it?" Jonah asked, his voice quiet but laced with fear. "Or are we just walking to our graves?" Emily paused for a moment, glancing back at the group. They all looked at her, their faces worn with fatigue, their eyes searching for an answer. The air felt heavy with the question, and for a split second, Emily wasn't sure how to respond. The truth was, she didn't know if they could make it. She didn't know if they could survive this planet's harshest challenges. But she wasn't going to let them fall apart. Not now. "Look around you," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "We've already made it through the worst. This desert has thrown everything it has at us. But we're still standing. We're still moving forward. That's all that matters." She glanced at the mountain range, the peak just barely visible through the haze of heat rising from the ground. "And as long as we're still moving, we're not done yet." They didn't say anything more, but the silence was different this time. It was not one of resignation or doubt, but of quiet determination. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in days, Emily could see a flicker of hope in their eyes again. Together, they pressed on, one step at a time. Hours passed as the team slogged onward, their bodies weighed down by fatigue, their minds clouded with doubt. The mountain range, which had seemed so distant when they first set their sights on it, now felt like the only thing tethering them to the possibility of survival. But with each step, the terrain grew more treacherous. The rocky ground beneath their boots was uneven and jagged, and the thin air made each breath feel like an effort. Every one of them was nearing their breaking point. By midday, the sun was directly overhead, casting a suffocating heat across the land. Their water reserves had all but disappeared, and their pace had slowed to a crawl. They no longer spoke much, the silence broken only by the occasional grunt or sigh. Marcus was leading the group now, despite his exhaustion, and Emily was still pushing forward, though she could feel the weight of her own weariness creeping in. "I don't know how much longer I can keep going," Priya muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. This is beyond what I thought we could endure." Emily glanced at the biologist, seeing the deep circles under her eyes and the cracked lips. They were all in bad shape, but she couldn't let anyone give up. Not now. "We're almost there," Emily said, though even she wasn't sure if it was true. The mountain range was within reach, but with every step, the gap between them and the summit seemed to stretch further and further. "We've been saying that for days," Marcus muttered, a trace of bitterness in his voice, "and every time, the distance just keeps growing. It's like the desert is playing games with us." Emily knew he was right. The closer they got to the mountains, the more elusive the goal seemed. It felt like they were trapped in some cruel illusion, a mirage taunting them, keeping them just out of reach of the safety they desperately needed. But she couldn't let herself entertain those thoughts. They had to keep moving. There was no other option. As they crested another rocky ridge, Emily's breath caught in her throat. In the distance, the jagged peaks of the mountains loomed larger, but something had changed. At the base of the mountains, barely visible against the harsh landscape, was a small oasis. A patch of green surrounded by rocky outcrops, offering a stark contrast to the dry, unforgiving desert around it. For a moment, Emily wasn't sure if she was imagining it. Her mind had been playing tricks on her for days, and the heat had left her delirious at times. But the sight of the oasis, with its shimmering pools of water and patches of vegetation, felt real. "Do you see that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. The team followed her gaze, their eyes wide with disbelief. Jonah, his face pale from the journey, staggered forward. "That can't be real, can it?" "It has to be," Emily replied, her voice thick with hope. "We found it. That's the shelter we've been looking for. It's real." For the first time in days, something stirred inside her, something that felt like hope. It was faint, fragile, but it was there. They moved toward the oasis with renewed urgency, each of them pushing their aching bodies as fast as they could. The sight of water, real water, was enough to give them a burst of energy. The sound of their boots crunching against the rocky earth seemed louder now, as if they were approaching something far more important than just a physical destination. As they drew closer, the details of the oasis became clearer. There was a small, shallow pond nestled among the rocks, its surface shimmering in the sunlight. Sparse vegetation clung to life around the water, and the air seemed to be cooler here, as though the mountains themselves were providing some shelter from the heat. But the most important thing was the water. They were going to survive. They were going to make it. Marcus reached the edge of the pond first, kneeling beside it and cupping his hands to drink. His hand shook as he brought the water to his lips, and for a moment, Emily thought he might collapse from sheer relief. The rest of the team gathered around him, drinking in turns, their bodies desperate for the life-giving liquid. As Emily took her first sip, she closed her eyes, letting the coolness of the water wash over her. It wasn't just the physical relief, though that was immense. It was the emotional release. The uncertainty, the fear, the doubt that had haunted them for so long began to melt away with each drop. "We made it," Jonah whispered, his voice filled with awe. "We actually made it." Emily looked around at her team, their faces marked with exhaustion, but now filled with the light of survival. They had done it. Against all odds, they had found their oasis. But as Emily drank, she couldn't shake the feeling that their journey wasn't over. This was just the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where they would have to rebuild, find a way to communicate with their rescuers, and figure out how to survive on this harsh planet for as long as it took. For now, though, they could rest. They had earned it. And for the first time in days, Emily allowed herself to breathe deeply, to believe, just for a moment, that they had finally made it to safety. The oasis was a brief but much-needed reprieve, and the team collapsed onto the cool ground, savoring the water and shade it offered. They drank until their bodies felt nourished once more, their minds clearing from the fog of dehydration and exhaustion. The atmosphere was different here, calmer, almost as if the desert itself had momentarily allowed them a moment of peace. But even in this moment of relief, Emily knew they couldn't afford to get complacent. The oasis might be a lifesaver, but it was also isolated. The mountains that towered over them were beautiful, but they were harsh and unforgiving, and they had no idea how long they would be able to sustain themselves here. Their true challenge wasn't over yet. "We can't stay here forever," Emily said, her voice steadied, despite the exhaustion that still weighed on her. "We need to figure out our next step. We can't just rely on this small patch of water. If we stay here too long, we risk running out of resources." Marcus, who had been unusually quiet since they arrived, nodded. His face had regained some color, though it was still pale from their ordeal. "We need to explore. We need to find out what's beyond the mountains. There might be more resources or a way to signal for help." Priya, now visibly more alert after drinking, looked out across the oasis, her expression thoughtful. "We don't know if this water is even safe in the long term. There might be contaminants, or the ecosystem around here could collapse just like everything else. We should be cautious." Jonah, always quick to act, looked at Emily. "What are we going to do about our shelter? We can't keep surviving like this, moving from one temporary hiding place to the next." Emily's heart felt heavy at the mention of shelter. The storm had obliterated their last refuge, and though the oasis offered some relief, it wasn't a permanent solution. She could feel the weight of the responsibility pressing down on her. They needed more than water. They needed a strategy, a plan for what came next. "First, we rest," Emily said firmly, though her mind was already racing. "We've earned it. We'll stay here for the night, recover, and tomorrow we'll scout the area. We'll find out what's beyond the mountains, look for long-term resources. We'll make a plan." That night, as the sun set over the mountains and the temperature dropped, the team gathered around the oasis, taking turns resting and keeping watch. The silence of the desert was almost eerie, broken only by the occasional rustle of the wind. The stars above them twinkled like distant beacons, a reminder of just how far they were from home. Emily lay back on the ground, staring up at the sky. Her thoughts drifted to the planet's cruel beauty, the vastness of the desert, the storms, the endless expanse of sand and rock. She had known it would be a challenge, but she hadn't expected it to test every ounce of their will to survive. They were alive, yes, but how much longer could they keep going? The weight of responsibility hung over her, but she couldn't afford to give in to the fear. Not now. Not when they had made it this far. The next morning, the team set out to explore the area. They traveled cautiously, keeping a sharp eye on their surroundings. The rocky terrain was difficult to navigate, but with the water supply secured for now, they could afford to be meticulous. The mountain range stretched endlessly before them, its peaks sharp and intimidating, but the promise of discovery drove them forward. Emily's hopes surged as they climbed higher, the view expanding with every step. They were closer to understanding the land they had been stranded on. If there were more oases, more hidden resources, they might just be able to survive. The mountains were not an obstacle but a pathway to something greater, perhaps a way off this planet, or at the very least, a way to live here without constantly running from death. After hours of careful exploration, they found something unexpected. Nestled in the shadow of a cliff, they discovered a cave, deep and wide. Its entrance was partially obscured by overgrown plants, but it was unmistakable: shelter. Inside, the temperature was cool and dry, a stark contrast to the sweltering heat outside. And at the far end of the cave, they found something even more surprising: remnants of a long-forgotten civilization. Faint carvings covered the walls, and strange symbols adorned the stone, the signs of a species that had once thrived here, but had vanished long before their arrival. The realization hit them all at once. They weren't the first to have struggled on this planet. Others had come before them, had fought and survived in this same desert, and now their remnants lay in the shadows of this forgotten place. This could be it, Priya whispered, her voice full of wonder. This could be the key. If there were others here before us, we might find a way to communicate, a way to understand how they survived. Emily's mind raced with possibilities. This cave, this discovery, it could be the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Maybe it was the key to unraveling the desert's secrets, or maybe it was the first step toward finding a way off the planet entirely. For the first time since they had crash-landed, Emily allowed herself to think of a future beyond survival. The fight wasn't over, but this discovery gave her hope, real hope, that they might just make it through.